Northern Wyoming, October 1952. When Thomas Brennan started digging a hole 8 feet deep behind his cabin, the most experienced homesteaders in Carbon County told him he was wasting his time on the dumbest storage idea they'd ever seen. Underground meant damp. Underground meant rot. Underground meant firewood that would hiss and smoke instead of burn. Every man who'd survived a Wyoming winter knew you kept cordwood elevated, covered, and open to air. You didn't bury it like a corpse. But by February, when neighbors were burning through wet wood that gave half the heat it should, Thomas was pulling bone-dry splits from his underground shelter that burned so hot and clean his stone fireplace barely needed feeding. What he'd discovered would cut firewood consumption by 60% across 3 counties and prove that sometimes the worst idea is actually the only one that understands what moisture really does. Before we dig into the engineering secret that transformed winter survival, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what's the coldest winter you've ever faced. Because this story proves that the solutions everyone mocks are often the only ones that actually solve the problem. Thomas Brennan wasn't trying to revolutionize anything. He was a 38-year-old former coal miner who'd bought 80 acres of scrub pine and granite 12 miles south of Rawlins after the mine closed in 1951. He'd spent 15 years underground, learning how air moved through tunnels, how moisture behaved in enclosed spaces, how temperature stayed remarkably constant 6 feet below the surface, regardless of what hell froze or burned above. When he built his cabin that first summer, he followed the standard design. Notched pine logs, fieldstone foundation, steep roof, nothing fancy. But his first winter, 1951 to 52, taught him something that gnawed at him through the spring. He'd bought 8 cords of seasoned pine in September, properly split, properly aged. The seller guaranteed 18% moisture. Content, dry enough to burn clean. Thomas stacked it in a traditional woodshed, 3 walls and a roof, open on one side for air circulation, textbook storage. Everyone did it this way. By December, that guaranteed dry wood was wet. Not soaking, but damp enough that every piece hissed when it hit the fire. Damp enough to produce smoke that stung your eyes and creosote that built up in the chimney like black honey. Damp enough that Thomas burned through 6 cords before March, just trying to keep his cabin at 50 degrees. Wood that should have delivered 7,000 BTUs per pound was delivering maybe 4,500. He was burning 40% more fuel to get 40% less heat. The problem wasn't the wood. It was Wyoming weather doing what Wyoming weather does. Wind-driven snow found every gap in that woodshed. Temperature swings from 20 above to 30 below created freeze-thaw cycles that forced moisture into the wood grain like a hydraulic press. Humidity from winter storms penetrated the stack. By midwinter, wood, that had started at 18% moisture content, was sitting at 28 to 32%, essentially wet enough to be useless. Thomas watched his neighbors fighting the same battle. Woodsheds with tarps that ripped in the wind, covered stacks that trapped condensation, elevated racks that let snow blow underneath. Every method tried to keep water out. Every method failed because they were fighting Wyoming weather with barriers, and Wyoming weather doesn't respect barriers. That spring, Thomas had an idea that came from 15 years of breathing underground air. What if you didn't fight the weather at all? What if you just removed the wood from where weather could reach it? In May 1952, he started digging behind his cabin. Not a cellar, not a root cellar. A shelter specifically for firewood, 12 feet long, 8 feet wide, 7 feet deep. He dug down through topsoil into the clay hardpan, the dense, water-resistant layer that miners knew stayed dry even during spring floods. The walls were straight, the floor level, the ceiling reinforced with 6x6 timbers salvaged from the mine. He built ventilation shafts at both ends, 6-inch diameter pipes that rose 3 feet above ground level, capped with screened hoods to keep rain out, while letting air move. The entrance was a sloped ramp with double doors at ground level, and another set at the bottom, creating an airlock that prevented weather from penetrating the interior. The roof structure was critical. He laid 8 iron 8 beams across the top, then a layer of planks, then 12 inches of clay excavated from the pit, then 6 inches of topsoil and sod. The earth roof provided insulation and protection. Rain and snow would hit dirt, not wood. The mass would moderate temperature swings. Inside, he built storage racks from scrap lumber. Each rack held wood horizontal, bark side down, with 2 inches of airspace between rows. The racks sat 6 inches off the floor. Air could circulate completely around every piece of wood. The total cost was maybe $40 in lumber for the timber supports and racks. Everything else was labor. He worked alone, moving 70 cubic yards of dirt with a shovel and wheelbarrow over 3 weeks. By late June, it was finished. From outside, it looked like a grass-covered mound with 2 small pipes sticking up and a ramp leading to wooden doors set into the hillside. It looked like a root cellar, a storm shelter, maybe a crazy person's bunker. It didn't look like a place to store firewood. The ridicule started the first time someone saw it. Martin Howell, who ran the general store and had built 9 cabins in Carbon County, stopped by in early July. Thomas was just finishing the sod layer on the roof. "What in God's name is that?" Howell asked. "Firewood storage." Howell stared. Then he laughed. Not maliciously, just the reflexive laugh of a man seeing something so wrong it has to be a joke. "Thomas, you just built a tomb for wet wood. You know what happens underground? Moisture. You know what firewood needs? Air, dry air, sunlight. You just buried your winter fuel in a damp hole." "It's not damp," Thomas said. "Clay layer's waterproof. Ventilation keeps air moving." "Ventilation?" Howell shook his head. 2 little pipes fighting condensation from a whole pit of wood? That's not ventilation. That's wishful thinking. Wood's going to sweat underground. Come November, you'll open those doors and find a stack of moldy, rotted fuel that won't burn if you soaked it in kerosene. At the sawmill, word spread fast. Thomas Brennan had dug a grave for his firewood. Men who knew timber, who'd cut and split and stacked for decades, were baffled. Underground storage violated every principle of seasoning wood. A logger named Carl Dietrich stopped by in August. He'd been cutting timber for 25 years, knew wood like some men knew cards. "I've seen wet wood kill men," Carl said quietly. "Cabin gets cold because the fire won't burn right. Temperature drops. People get desperate, push the fire too hard. Chimney catches from creosote buildup. I've seen 3 cabins burn because men were trying to heat with wet wood." He pointed at the underground shelter. "That pit's going to give you the wettest wood anyone's ever tried to burn, and it's going to be dangerous." Even Thomas's own cousin Robert, a carpenter in Laramie, thought he'd lost his mind. "You spent 3 weeks digging a hole to ruin perfectly good firewood. Why didn't you just build a proper woodshed? Roof, 3 walls, open front, elevated floor. It's been working for 100 years. "Has it?" Thomas asked. "Because I burned through 6 cords last winter and still froze. Wood was wet by January. So you stack it better, cover it tighter. You don't bury it underground like you're hiding evidence." By September, the story had reached the county extension office. An agent named Harold Pierce drove out specifically to see the underground shelter and warn Thomas about the dangers of improper wood storage. "Mr. Brennan, this setup is problematic. Underground environments have higher relative humidity. Wood stored below grade will absorb moisture from the surrounding earth. You'll end up with fuel that's not only wet, but potentially dangerous from mold and fungal growth." Thomas tried to explain the clay barrier, the ventilation system, the temperature stability of underground storage. Pierce cut him off. "I've reviewed agricultural bulletins from 3 states. Not one recommends underground wood storage. There's a reason for that. It doesn't work." The harshest criticism came at the church social in late September. Thomas rarely attended, but his wife, Catherine, insisted they show up. He stood in the back while men discussed winter preparations. Martin Howell, the general store owner, brought it up publicly. "Before winter hits, I want to mention something. Thomas Brennan's got his firewood stored underground. I know it's his business, but wet wood's a safety issue for the whole community. If his chimney catches fire from creosote, sparks could travel. We're all close enough to worry." An older homesteader named Samuel Garrett nodded. "I wintered through 38, the year the cold killed 40% of the livestock in this county. Men who survived did it with dry wood. Men who didn't often had wet fuel. That underground pit seems like a good way to guarantee wet fuel. Thomas stood up. Wood's been down there since June. It's dry. You've checked? Howell asked. I have. It's drier than it started. The room went quiet. Howell's voice took on an edge. Thomas, you're a good man, but you don't know wood the way some of us do. Clay or no clay, ventilation or no ventilation, you've created conditions for moisture retention. When you open that pit in November, you're going to find out that being underground means being wet. Always has. Always will. Catherine touched Thomas's arm, a gentle signal to let it go. He sat down. The meeting moved on. But the judgment hung in the air like smoke. Thomas Brennan had built something foolish, and winter would prove it. The testing began in early October when Thomas bought his winter supply. 7 cords of split pine, freshly cut, guaranteed to be at 20% moisture content or less. He had the seller test 3 random pieces with a moisture meter. They measured 19%, 18%, and 20%. Good, dry wood. Thomas loaded it into his underground shelter, stacking it carefully on the racks, allowing air circulation around each piece. The space held all 7 cords with room to spare. He closed the double doors, securing them against wind and weather. 3 days later, Martin Howell stopped by with a moisture meter. I want to see this miracle storage in action. They walked down the ramp together. Thomas opened the doors. The interior was cool, maybe 55 degrees, noticeably warmer than the outside air, which sat at 42. The smell was dry wood and earth. No mustiness, no dampness, just the clean scent of pine. Howell selected a piece from the center of the stack, the place most likely to be affected by underground humidity. He tested it. The meter read 18%. Give it time, Howell said. You just put it in there. Wait a month. Wait until November when the ground moisture rises. October passed. Temperature outside swung from 60 degrees during the day to 20 at night. 2 heavy rainstorms dumped 3 inches. An early snow in late October added another 4 inches of moisture to the ground. Surface wood stacks across the valley were getting hammered. Tarps ripped in wind gusts. Snow blew into supposedly covered sheds. Temperature swings created condensation on wood surfaces. By late October, wood that had started the season at 18 to 20% moisture was climbing toward 25 to 28%. Thomas tested his underground wood on November 1st. The piece he pulled from the deepest part of the stack measured 16% moisture content. It had gotten drier. He tested 5 more pieces from different locations. 15%, 16%, 17%, 15%, 16%. Every single piece had lost moisture. Not absorbed it. Lost it. The physics were simple, though Thomas didn't use those terms. Underground, 7 feet deep in Wyoming hardpan, the temperature stayed between 50 and 55 degrees year-round. That stability prevented condensation. Surface wood faced temperature swings of 40 degrees in a day, creating conditions where moisture condensed on cold wood, then didn't fully evaporate. The ventilation shafts created a gentle airflow. Warm, slightly moist air rose out the top. Cooler, drier air was pulled in to replace it. The circulation was slow, maybe 1 complete air exchange every 6 to 8 hours, but it was constant and it carried moisture away steadily. The clay barrier prevented ground moisture from wicking into the storage space. The elevated racks kept wood off any surface water. The earth roof's mass prevented temperature fluctuations that would cause condensation. Thomas was watching his firewood season in ideal conditions while everyone else's was getting wet in real conditions. But nobody believed him yet. Numbers on a meter weren't the same as performance in a firebox. The real test would come when winter demanded heat and wet wood failed to deliver. November brought the cold. By the 15th, nighttime temperatures were hitting single digits. By the 20th, they were below 0. Wyoming wind came screaming across the plains at 40 miles per hour, driving wind chills to 30 below. Families across Carbon County started burning through their wood supplies faster than expected. The wet wood wasn't just burning poorly, it was catastrophically inefficient. Carl Dietrich, the logger who'd warned about wet wood dangers, found himself in exactly the situation he'd described. His wood, stored in a traditional elevated shed with a good roof, was testing at 29% moisture content. When he threw it on the fire, it hissed and steamed. Smoke poured back into the cabin from poor draft. The wood gave maybe 4,000 BTUs per pound instead of the 7,000 it should. He was burning a cord every 10 days just to keep his cabin at 48 degrees. His chimney was building creosote so fast he had to clean it twice a week. His children coughed from the smoke. His wife stuffed rags around the windows to stop drafts. Martin Howell's situation was better, but not by much. His woodshed was well designed, but moisture had still penetrated. His wood tested at 26% moisture. He was burning 3/4 cord every 2 weeks, maintaining maybe 52 degrees inside. Samuel Garrett, the old-timer who'd survived the winter of '38, was going through a cord every 12 days. His cabin hovered around 50 degrees. He'd already burned through 2 of his 8 cords, and it was only mid-November. Then people started noticing Thomas Brennan's chimney, or rather, the lack of smoke coming from it. Most cabins pumped thick gray-white smoke constantly, the signature of wet wood burning inefficiently. Thomas's chimney showed a thin, clear trail, the kind of smoke you'd see in April, not November. On November 22nd, Carl Dietrich rode over on his way to town. It was 8 degrees outside, wind blowing hard from the northwest. Carl was bundled in 3 layers, riding fast to keep from freezing. Thomas was outside in a canvas coat, no gloves, splitting kindling. "You're not cold?" Carl asked. "Just stepped out. Cabin's warm." Carl looked at the thin smoke trail. "How much wood you burning?" "Maybe 1/3 cord every 2 weeks." Carl stared. He was burning more than twice that. "And your temperature inside?" "Around 62 degrees. Was 65 this morning." That night, Carl told 3 people. By the next day, half the valley knew something impossible was happening at the Brennan place. On November 25th, Martin Howell showed up with Harold Pierce, the county extension agent, and 2 other experienced homesteaders. They brought thermometers and moisture meters. "We need to see this for ourselves," Howell said. Thomas opened the cabin door. Warmth rolled out like a physical presence. Inside, Catherine was cooking in a regular dress, no coat. The thermometer read 63 degrees. Outside temperature, 6 degrees, a 57-degree difference. "How much wood did you burn yesterday?" Pierce asked. Thomas showed them his log. 5 pieces in the morning, 6 in the evening, about 1/10 of a cord. "That's impossible," Howell said. "I'm burning 5 times that and barely staying above 50. They walked to the underground shelter. Thomas opened the doors. Cool air, but not cold. The temperature inside the pit read 53 degrees, while outside was 6 degrees. The wood sat on its racks, completely dry to the touch. Pierce selected a piece from the center of the deepest stack. He tested it with his moisture meter. 14% moisture content. He tested 5 more pieces. 13%, 15%, 14%, 14%, 15%. Howell pulled a piece from his own wagon, wood from his supposedly dry shed. He tested it. 27% moisture. The comparison was devastating. Thomas's underground wood, stored in conditions everyone said would make it wet, was testing 50% drier than Howell's surface wood, stored in conditions everyone said would keep it dry. "How is this possible?" Pierce asked quietly. "Temperature stability," Thomas said. "No freeze-thaw cycles, no condensation, just steady conditions and slow airflow that carries moisture away." They stood in the underground shelter, surrounded by 7 cords of wood getting drier every day, while surface wood across the valley was getting wetter every day, and the implications were staggering. Stay with me, because the numbers that came out of that underground shelter didn't just surprise the county. They rewrote the rules about firewood storage. Word spread like wildfire through frozen valleys. By early December, men were making trips to the Brennan place just to see the underground shelter and test the wood themselves. Every visitor brought their own moisture meter. Every visitor got the same results, 13 to 15% moisture content when surface wood across the region was sitting at 25 to 30%. But moisture meters only told part of the story. The real proof came in the burn. On December 8th, a group of 5 homesteaders gathered at Thomas's cabin for a demonstration. Carl Dietrich brought wood from his own supply, testing at 28% moisture. Thomas pulled a comparable piece from his underground stock, testing at 14%. Both pieces were split pine, similar diameter, similar length. As identical as 2 pieces of wood could be, except for one critical difference: where they'd been stored. They built 2 identical fires in Thomas's fireplace, side by side. Same arrangement, same kindling, same starting conditions. Carl's wet wood on the left, Thomas's dry wood on the right. Everyone gathered close to watch. The outcome seemed predictable to most. Dry wood would burn better, sure, but how much better could it really be? The answer was dramatic. Carl's wood hissed and steamed when lit. Thick white smoke poured from the ends. The flames were yellow and weak, struggling to sustain combustion against the moisture. Water inside the wood was turning to steam, consuming energy that should have gone to heat. After 15 minutes, the wood was still smoking heavily, barely producing heat. The yellow flames licked at the surface, unable to penetrate deep into wood that was still too wet to burn efficiently. Thomas's wood caught immediately. The flames were blue-white, hot and clean. No hissing, no smoke, just intense combustion. The dry wood ignited almost explosively, the way properly seasoned fuel should. Within 10 minutes, the wood was burning so hot, the fireplace stones began to glow orange. The heat radiating from that single piece was enough to warm everyone standing nearby. The contrast became more pronounced as time passed. Carl's piece produced thick, acrid smoke that made eyes water. It crackled and sputtered, releasing steam and partially combusted gases. The firebox filled with smoke that couldn't fully draft because the fire wasn't hot enough to create strong convection. Some smoke spilled back into the room. Thomas's piece burned with the clean intensity of a blacksmith's forge. The flames consumed the wood systematically, turning it to glowing coals that radiated steady heat. No smoke escaped into the room. The draft was strong and clean, pulling all exhaust straight up the chimney. After 30 minutes, Carl's piece was 40% consumed, still smoking, having released perhaps 3,000 BTUs. Much of the wood's potential energy had been wasted evaporating water instead of producing heat. The remaining wood was partially charred but still structurally intact, burning slowly and inefficiently. Thomas's piece was 70% consumed, burned clean to white ash and glowing coals, having released approximately 6,500 BTUs, more than twice the heat from the same amount of wood in the same amount of time. The difference wasn't marginal. It was categorical. The men watching stood silent. Martin Howell broke the quiet first. "That's the same wood," he said, though everyone knew he meant the same species, the same size, just stored different. Carl sat back on his heels, watching the comparison. "I've been burning half as much heat as I should all winter, and paying for it with twice the wood." Samuel Garrett, the old-timer who'd survived brutal winters through sheer endurance, spoke quietly. "In 38, I burned 11 cords, trying to keep my family alive. If I'd had wood burning like that, I might have made it on 6. That's 5 cords difference. That's the difference between making it through and not making it." The demonstration continued for another hour. They burned through 4 more comparison sets. Different wood from different sources, different moisture levels, different sizes. The results were consistent. Wood stored underground at 13 to 16% moisture consistently outperformed surface-stored wood at 25 to 30% by factors of 2 to 1 or better in heat output, burn time, and cleanliness. Harold Pierce took detailed notes. He measured temperatures at different distances from the fires. He timed burn rates. He collected ash samples to analyze combustion completeness. His scientific training demanded thorough documentation because what he was witnessing contradicted accepted wisdom so completely that skeptics would demand proof. The mathematics were brutal when extrapolated. If Thomas was getting 6,500 BTUs per pound, and his neighbors were getting 3,000, Thomas needed 1 pound of wood to do what took them 2.2 pounds. Over a full winter, that difference meant Thomas would burn roughly 45% of what they would to achieve the same heat. But the efficiency went even deeper. Dry wood burned hotter, which meant better draft, which meant more complete combustion, which meant less creosote, which meant safer operation and less maintenance. Thomas cleaned his chimney once a month. His neighbors cleaned theirs twice a week. The time savings alone was significant. Harold Pierce, the extension agent who'd warned against underground storage, conducted formal measurements over the next 3 weeks. His report documented what he called empirically superior performance under identical field conditions. Brennan Underground Storage System. Average wood moisture content, 14.2%. Average heat output per pound, 6,400 BTUs. Average wood consumption, 0.35 cords per 2 weeks. Average cabin. Temperature, 62 degrees chimney cleaning frequency. Once per 4 weeks. Smoke production, minimal clear exhaust. Standard surface storage, valley average. Average wood moisture content, 27.1%. Average heat output per pound, 3,800 BTUs. Average wood consumption, 0.85 cords per 2 weeks. Average cabin temperature, 51 degrees chimney cleaning frequency, twice per week. Smoke production, heavy white-gray exhaust. The underground system was achieving 68% better fuel efficiency while maintaining 11 degrees higher temperature and requiring 87% less maintenance. Pierce's report concluded with a sentence that would be quoted across Wyoming for the next decade. Previous assumptions about underground storage creating moisture retention appear to be fundamentally incorrect when proper engineering principles are applied. By mid-December, the first replication attempts began. A homesteader named Vernon Walsh, who lived 6 miles north, started digging. He didn't have access to mine timbers, so he built his shelter with pole construction, creating a 10 by 8 foot space 6 feet deep. He used lodgepole pine for the roof supports and rough-cut planks for the ceiling. He copied Thomas's ventilation system exactly, 2 6-inch pipes with screened caps, and followed the same earth roof design with clay and sod layers. He moved his remaining wood supply, about 4 cords, underground on December 18th. The wood tested at 26% moisture when it went in, already compromised by weeks of surface storage during variable weather. Vernon didn't expect miracles, just improvement. The results exceeded his expectations. By January 3rd, after just 16 days underground, the wood was testing at 19%. The stable 52-degree environment and gentle airflow had pulled 7 percentage points of moisture out in 2 weeks. By January 20th, testing showed 16% moisture content. His fuel efficiency improved by 40%, even though he was starting with compromised wood that had already absorbed more moisture than it should have held. Vernon's cabin temperature rose from an average of 49 degrees to 56 degrees, while his wood consumption dropped from 3/4 of a cord per 2 weeks to half a cord. The improvement wasn't as dramatic as Thomas's results because Vernon's wood hadn't started as dry, but it proved the system could rehabilitate already wet fuel. 2 more families started digging in January, despite frozen ground making excavation brutal work. The Carter brothers, homesteading adjacent properties near Elk Mountain, coordinated their efforts and built a shared underground shelter positioned on the property line. At 16 feet long and 10 feet wide, it held 12 cords and served both families. They dug in shifts, breaking frozen ground with picks and mattocks, hauling dirt in frozen chunks. By February, 7 underground wood shelters were under construction across Carbon County. Not all were identical to Thomas's design. Some were shallower, limited by rocky soil or high water tables. Some were larger, built by families pooling resources. Some used different roof structures, from simple pole frames to elaborate stone vaulting salvaged from abandoned mine entrances. A rancher named Douglas Peterman built his shelter into an existing hillside, excavating horizontally instead of vertically. His design required less digging and provided natural drainage, but achieved the same temperature stability and ventilation principles. His wood moisture dropped from 28% to 15% over 3 weeks. An inventive homesteader named Alice Brennan, no relation to Thomas, built a hybrid above-ground structure using the underground principles. She created an insulated shed with 2 feet of packed earth on all sides and the roof, essentially burying a wooden structure instead of digging a pit. Her results were slightly less impressive than fully underground storage, with wood moisture stabilizing at 18%. But the construction was easier for someone working alone. The variations proved that the core principles mattered more than exact replication. Temperature stability, moisture barrier, controlled ventilation, these were the critical elements. The specific implementation could adapt to local conditions, available materials, and individual circumstances. The adoption wasn't universal. Some homesteaders with excellent surface storage setups saw no reason to dig. Some didn't have the labor available for excavation. Some just preferred traditional methods. But for families struggling with wet wood and high consumption, the underground approach offered measurable, immediate improvement. Martin Howell, who'd been Thomas's harshest critic, didn't build an underground shelter. But he did modify his existing woodshed based on the principles. He insulated the roof to reduce temperature swings, added ventilation to improve airflow, and raised his stacks higher off the ground. His wood moisture dropped from 27% to 21%. Not as good as underground, but a significant improvement. Carl Dietrich built a hybrid system. He dug a 4-foot-deep pit, but instead of going fully underground, he built conventional walls above grade, creating a partially buried structure with the thermal mass benefits of earth contact and the convenience of walk-in access. His wood moisture stabilized at 17%, and his fuel consumption dropped by 50%. By the winter of 1953-54, the transformation was visible. 19 families in Carbon County had some form of below-grade wood storage. Fuel consumption across those families averaged 42% lower than comparable households using surface storage. Cabin temperatures averaged 8 degrees warmer. Chimney fires dropped to near zero among underground storage users. The county extension office, initially skeptical, began actively recommending the technique. Pierce's report was distributed to extension agents in Montana, Colorado, and Idaho. By 1955, variations of underground wood storage had appeared in remote areas across 4 states. The technique never became standard in the way traditional woodsheds were standard. It required labor, planning, and suitable soil conditions, but it established itself as a proven alternative for anyone willing to question assumptions about moisture and storage. Thomas Brennan's original shelter served him for 23 years. In 1975, when he sold the property and moved to town, the new owners found the underground storage still fully functional. The timbers were sound, the ventilation still worked, the space was dry. The design had required essentially zero maintenance over 2 decades. The physics that made it work were never mysterious. Underground temperature stability prevents condensation. Slow ventilation removes moisture without creating drafts that carry in weather. Clay barriers prevent wicking. Elevation prevents pooling. These principles had been understood in root cellars and mining for centuries. Thomas just applied them to firewood. What made the story remarkable wasn't the engineering. It was the resistance to testing it. Men with decades of experience had known that underground meant wet. They'd known it so completely that they'd mocked the idea without measuring, criticized it without testing, and nearly prevented its adoption through certainty alone. Carl Dietrich, sitting in Thomas's cabin on a February evening in 1954, said something that captured the lesson perfectly. I spent 25 years cutting timber and thought I knew wood. Turns out I knew tradition. Thomas knew physics, and physics doesn't care what we've always done. The underground shelter stood as proof that the best solutions often violate the rules everyone assumes are sacred. That moisture behavior depends on conditions, not location. That everyone knows is the most dangerous phrase in engineering, and that sometimes the dumbest idea is the only one that actually solves the problem. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and tell us about the coldest winter you've ever faced. Hit that subscribe button for one proven survival technique every week. Hit the like button if this story changed how you think about storage and moisture, because the wisest solutions often come from questioning everything everyone assumes is settled truth.